Kruse,
Savanna, Echols.
Dalton, Ludington.
Poncelet.
You were a number, you weren't a name, said by Jim Quillen, a former inmate to the federal prison system, Alcatraz.
All of us have limitations in our daily lives. There are certain rules and routines that we must follow. For example, on page 31 in our Zambroda Mazeppa handbook, it provides specific examples on inappropriate clothing that cannot be worn in school. We are all very familiar with this rule, but even though we follow rules daily, we have never experienced the extreme and rigid rules placed at Alcatraz.
Alcatraz is a former maximum security prison located in the San Francisco Bay.
First, we will give you a timeline on the evolution of Alcatraz Island. Next, what life was like in the prison. Then, we will inform you on some of the famous inmates who served time at Alcatraz. And finally, we will talk about some of the famous escape attempts.
I will begin by explaining the timeline of the well-known island and prison. Alcatraz was many things before it became the famous prison we all know for. The island itself has been there for thousands of years, but was not discovered until the 1700s. In 1775, a Spanish explorer by the name of Juan Manuel de Ayala discovered the island and decided to give it a name. He called it Isla de los Alcatraces, which means Island of Pelicans in English. The island remained uninhabited until the 1850s. According to Leslie Sinclair, an author for the American Psychiatric Association, in an article titled Alcatraz Led Several Lives Before Convicts Arrived, published in February 2013, the U.S. government ordered for 7 lighthouses to be put on the west coast of the United States. The first one was put on Alcatraz Island. During the Civil War, Union soldiers used the island to house Confederate sympathizers, and it was the largest fort west of the Mississippi River. It continued to house military defenders until 1933. In 1907, the prison was transferred over to the Pacific branch of the U.S. prison system. In 1909, the prison was then demolished and began being rebuilt by the prisoners that were being held there. It was completed 4 years later. This is a picture of what the building looked like before the remodel and what it looked like after the remodel. In 1933, the prison was transferred over to then the U.S. Department of Justice. 1 year later, on July 1st, Alcatraz welcomed its first federal prisoners. According to Jorge Kruse, the president of the Britannica and a Master's of Business Administration, in an article titled Alcatraz, published in June 2016, it states the first warden, which is a high official in the prison system, was James A. Johnson until 1948. The prison remained open for many more years until it was closed on March 21st, 1963. It was rumored to have closed because of the possible successful escapes made by some of the prisoners. The real reason the prison was closed down by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy was because of the high cost it took to bring fresh water and waste to and from the prison. On November 20th, 1969, Native Americans flooded into the abandoned island in order to set up a protest against the U.S. government for social and political neglects against Native Americans. According to Paul Gazzolo, the vice president at Gale Research Incorporated, in an article titled The Occupation of Alcatraz, 1969 to 1971, published in 2003, he states that many different tribes took part in this protest. They included Cherokee, Navajo, Sioux, and many others. The amount of natives that occupied this island ranged from 2,000 to the 15 that were removed by federal marshals on June 11, 1971. In 1972, Alcatraz was then positioned into the Golden Gate National Recreation Area and is now one of San Francisco's top tourist destinations. The prison now hosts a triathlon, which is a competition that consists of biking, running, and swimming, and is called Escape from Alcatraz. This year will be the 37th one, and it is going to take place on June 11th. According to Mark Shapiro, the president of IMG, a leading global entertainment agency, in an article titled 2017 Escape from Alcatraz set to take place on June 11th, published in September 2016, it states that over 2,000 athletes from around the world will take place in this competition. The competition will start off with a 1.5-mile swim from the prison itself to San Francisco. It then goes into an 18-mile bike ride through the windy roads of San Francisco and finishes with an 8-mile run to the finish line.
Now that we have discussed what the island has been, I will now talk to you about what life was like for the prisoners while it was a federal prison. In the making of Alcatraz, the Federal Bureau of Prisons decided to take the small island in the San Francisco Bay Area and make the military fort and jail to a maximum security prison. Alcatraz served as a prison of choice for inmates who were particularly dangerous. Most prisoners at Alcatraz were prisoners who refused to follow the rules at other federal institutions. There were electric gates surrounding the prison and armed guards in and outside of the prison. James A. Johnson hired approximately 1 guard for every 3 prisoners, according to Straw Phelps, an American lawyer and political activist, in the article Alcatraz in 2002. The guards in The guard-to-prisoner ratio at other prisons was 1 guard for every 12 prisoners. A silence policy was put into place under James Johnson's ruling. Inmates considered this to be one of their most unbearable punishments. Several inmates were being driven insane by the severe rule of silence. No newspapers or radios were allowed. This policy was eventually proved unpopular and was abandoned. This was one of only a few policy changes that occurred over the prison's history. The policy at Alcatraz was to have a highly structured daily routine to teach inmates to follow rules. The routine rarely varied throughout the years and was considered extremely reliable. A whistle was blown at 6:30 a.m. to wake inmates up, and at 9:30 p.m. it was lights out. There was a total of 12 prisoner counts each day. Guards cannot have a regular routine. Here at school, most of us have a certain time you go to the bathroom or get a drink of water. Guards had to vary the times when they did these things because inmates would pick up on their routines. At its highest capacity, Alcatraz could house 336 inmates, with its average population being 260, according to David Spears, president of Unicor, from the article Life at Prison in 2017. The prison never once reached its full capacity. Inmates were housed in single-occupancy cells. These cells were 9 feet by 5 feet, and the cell doors at Alcatraz consisted of 250 pounds of hardened steel, according to Jay Seller, communications consultant, from the article There Never Was a Harder Place Than the Rock in 1995. There were multiple isolation units at Alcatraz, which were nicknamed the Hole. Here is a picture of what the isolation unit looked like. Inmates were sent here when they needed to be punished. They could spend up to 19 days in the cell, and all the cell contained was a sink and a toilet, and the mattresses were taken away during the day. Inmates considered this to be one of the most severe punishments, and they were left in a constant state of boredom and severe isolation. There are 4 privileges an inmate could earn while at Alcatraz. These included work, visitation rights, access to the prison's library, and access to recreational activities such as paintings and music. Work assignments were given to prisoners who wanted to earn a wage. Once prison officials felt a man no longer impose a threat, he could then be sent to another federal institution to carry out his sentence and be released.
Now that you have learned what it is like for the prisoners behind bars, I will now give you a brief overview of what it was like some of the inmates were at Alcatraz. Between 1934 and 1963, Alcatraz housed a total of 1,576 inmates, according to Thomas Kane, the president of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, a U.S. federal law enforcement agency, and the article Alcatraz the Rock on April 17, 2016. Greg Moore, the president of the Conservancy's Public Agency Partners, a federal agency within the U.S. Department of Interior, in the article Alcatraz the Worst of the Worst on March 19, 2007, states that the 3 most feared inmates at Alcatraz were Alphonse Capone, George R. Kelly, and Robert Franklin Stroud. Al Capone, more known as Scarface or Alphonse Capone, more known as Scarface or Al Capone, was taken in by Johnny Toro, one of the most successful gang members on the East Coast at age 14. He got his nickname Scarface when he got into a bar fight and was cut in the face 3 times. He then moved to Chicago, where he helped Torrio with his alcohol smuggling, gambling, and prostitution enterprise. He then took over for Torrio when he retired in 1925. On February 14, 1929, Capone's men tried to assassinate Bugs Moran, a longtime rival of Capone's. They ended up killing 7 of Moran's men instead of Moran because he was tipped off just before the attack. The public called this the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On June 5th, 1931, Capone was found guilty by the U.S. government on 22 counts of income tax evasion. He was sent to the U.S. penitentiary in Atlanta, but then was sent to Alcatraz because of improper treatment. He stayed in Alcatraz for 11 years before he died of a heart attack. Here is a picture of what his cell looked like in Atlanta versus his cell in Alcatraz. George R. Kelly, known as Machine Gun Kelly, was a bootlegger, bank robber, and kidnapper in states all around the South. He started as a bootlegger until he was caught in 1927. He then married Catherine Thorne in 1930, and they started their life of crime together. She bought him his first machine gun and gave him his nickname Machine Gun Kelly. According to Loretta Lynch, the head of the U.S. Department of Justice and FBI, in the article George Machine Gun Kelly on May 18, 2016, states that on July 22, 1933, George and his partner went to Charles Urschel's house and kidnapped both him and his friend Walter Jarrett. They blindfolded them and took them across state lines, and once they identified which one was Urschel, they let Walter Jarrett go. A few days later, Mrs. Urschel found 3 letters, all from Charles. One of them gave specific instructions on where to leave $200,000 for them to return George back to his home. On July 31, 1933, after 9 days of being held captive, Charles finally returned home. Kelly was later picked up in Memphis, Tennessee in September and was sent to prison at Alcatraz in October. He was the first person to ever be tried under the Lindbergh Law because he used multiple states in a kidnapping. Robert Franklin Stroud, known as Birdman of Alcatraz, was sent to prison for manslaughter in 1911 after he shot a bartender in the face because he did not pay his prostitute. He was also a pimp out of Alaska. He was sent to McNeil Island in Washington State, where he threatened a nurse and threatened also other inmates. He then was sent to Leavenworth in Kansas and added 6 months to his sentence because he was a threat to the other inmates. He got his nickname Birdman when he found an injured bird in the courtyard and nursed it back to health. He was then sent to Alcatraz with life without parole because he stabbed a guard in the mess hall because they did not allow him to see his brother. Robert was in prison for 57 years of his life. Here is a picture of him when he first got to Alcatraz, and this is 11 years later. The very last person to ever arrive on Alcatraz Island was Frank Weatherman. He was the last inmate to ever arrive on the T-boat T-451 and received the number 1576. When they asked him what his final thoughts were on Alcatraz, Frank Weatherman stated, "Alcatraz was never good for nobody."
We've just talked about some of the famous inmates that were kept at Alcatraz. I will now discuss some of the famous escape attempts. There were 14 total escape attempts, involving 36 men. 23 of them were caught, 7 were killed, and 3 drowned. The remaining are Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin. Claims Deborah Hopkinson, an award-winning American author and historian who wrote the article Escape from Alcatraz in February 2012. The first escape attempt was made by a man named Joe Bowers on April 27, 1936. He was shot the moment he jumped the fence. Explained by Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, who wrote the article 2 Convicts Escape Alcatraz Prison, published in December 1937. He also wrote that on December 16, 1937, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rose were reported missing. They're believed to have jumped the fence and drowned while trying to swim to shore. According to Orville E. Dreyfus, publisher of the New York Times, who wrote the article 3 Alcatraz Convicts Cut Their Way Out with Spoons, published June 13, 1962, that in May 1946, 13 convicts gained control of a cell block and held off the U.S. Marines for 2 days. 2 guards and 3 inmates were killed. Floyd Wilson tried to escape July 23, 1956. He hid in the sea caves, but he was too afraid to swim to shore. He got cold and hungry and went back to the prison. The most famous escape attempt was made by Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin on June 11, 1962. The men cut holes in their cell walls, and they hid the holes with a painting that looked just like the wall. They cut the holes with fingernail clippers and spoons at first, but eventually they made a drill out of a vacuum cleaner motor. They also made fake heads out of toilet paper, cardboard, and cement chips, and painted them to look very real. They used real hair stolen from the prison barbershop to put on the heads. The men then climbed out of the holes in their cell wall, and they climbed up the pipes to the roof, where they then slid down a drain pipe to the ground. They used a raft made out of stolen raincoats to try to get to shore. It has never been confirmed that the men made it, but there is evidence to prove that it is possible. The raft was found on nearby Angel Island, and there was a report of a stolen car near the area where the men would have landed that night. There was a study that was done to show the likelihood of survival given different times and paths taken by the men, and it showed that if they left a little before midnight and paddled across the tide, that they would have survived. It was the biggest manhunt since 1932 looking for the men. The authorities ruled that they died at sea. There have been alleged sightings of the men to this day.
In conclusion, we have given you a brief understanding of what it was like at the prison Alcatraz. First, we discussed what the history was of Alcatraz. Then, we talked about what it was like for the people behind bars.
Then we talked about some notable people that served time at Alcatraz. And finally, we talked about some of the famous breakouts from the maximum security prison.
Alcatraz was a maximum security prison located in San Francisco Bay.
In this classroom, Mrs. Bradley calls us by our birth given name. In Alcatraz, you were just a number. Jim Quillen was not Jim. He was number 586.